Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, welcome back to a new season of the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Super excited to be here, back from a little, we'll call it sabbatical, as we say in the academic biz. Excited for this season. We'll have a few new formats. We'll have some guests to join us. But as always, we will be answering your questions, big and small, on world events and how to go about your day through the lens of a fighter pilot. I'm really excited for this. As always, you can like us and follow us at YouTube and Instagram, Fighter Pilot Professor. We'll jump right in. All right, so for our first episode today, we'll do a little recap of some of the things that we talked about previously, and also we'll talk about how not to die on Mount Stupid. So we'll dive right in to our first topic, a little recap of events for the summer. So the big topics of last season were what's going on in Ukraine, the war between Russia and Ukraine, obviously what's going on in the Middle East between Iran, Israel, and the Iranian proxies. And then finally, what's going on out in the South China Sea between primarily the Philippines and China. And really, frankly, on those fronts, not a whole lot has progressed. Starting first with Russia and the Ukraine, that war is basically stalemated right now, which, kind of in the World War I vein, we've turned into this trench warfare, war of attrition, which, in my opinion, unfortunately favors the Russians. It's a much larger country. They have much more resources. Their military is much bigger. So from that perspective, the sort of course of the war right now looks like it's favoring the Russians. However, the U.S. and several of the European allies have pitched in with some new equipment. Some of the restraints of U.S. Weapon employment as far as striking targets in Russia have been removed by the U.S. for the Ukrainians. And then also the Ukrainians got F-16s. I'm going to take an episode to just kind of discuss the interesting aspects of that later. But today we'll just kind of talk review. The other thing that's sort of major progression in the war there is the Ukrainians launched an incursion into actual Russian territory, as you can see from this map here, which shows the Ukrainian foray into Russia proper, which is a big deal. As always, invading Russia is a risky proposition, especially when winter comes along. Just ask Napoleon; he knows. But this is just an attempt, in my opinion, by the Ukrainians to sort of break that stalemate that's currently happening in the Eastern Front. Other things we've seen there are kind of crazy things like flame-throwing drones to sort of roust soldiers out of positions, and a widespread use of drones of various types on both sides, as well as cruise missiles and other things. And we see now this sort of war of attrition, trench warfare, stagnated front taking hold, or it's really already taken hold of the war. So although there's not a lot of progress in the war per se, there's some interesting small developments, and I'll take a few episodes to sort of delve into a couple of those things. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, with the Israelis and the Iranians, obviously the war in Gaza persists without a lot of breakthrough, unfortunately, and it's costly for both the Palestinians and for the Israelis in lives and money and etc. There's been obviously several incidents where the Iranians struck back, and those attacks were stopped by Israelis, U.S. and other allies, and But for now, again, we've kind of settled into this sort of steady stalemate. U.S. Forces have largely been sort of stood down. The threat from the Houthis and other Iranian proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah remain, but for the most part, this continues to be sort of a grinding air and ground campaign by the Israelis to sort of clear out Gaza. Unfortunately, that brings, because Gaza is a very densely populated part of the world, it brings a lot of civilian casualties. So we'll kind of keep an eye on that. If any sort of big breakthroughs happen, I'll run some episodes on that. But for now, we're just sort of watching. Similarly, out in the South China Sea, we got China and the Philippines still stalemated over the various islands that both of them have claims to. The biggest escalation that occurred over the summer was, and it's happened a couple of times now, Chinese and Filipino vessels of various types running into each other, which is a big deal. You know, two ships running into each other can lead to escalation in very real military ways. But so far, it's sort of stayed quiet. Both sides point fingers at each other, which is not unusual for these types of incidents. But still, it remains tense, although no real action on either side other than the sort of like status quo of tension that remains. So again, we'll keep an eye on that, and if anything bubbles up, I'll let you know. So that's what happened this summer. We'll keep an eye on the events. I'll update some of the Russia-Ukraine things with little interesting tidbits in separate episodes. But for now, just keep tuning in on YouTube or on Instagram, Fighter Pilot Professor, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so I thought I'd jump in with this little tidbit of, what I'm dubbing today, how to not die on Mount Stupid. And basically what this is like when you're learning a new skill, as a newbie, you go through this, obviously we've talked about this, go through this learning phase where I'm not very good at it, I'm unconfident in my skills of doing it, and I have to, you have to put in the grindy work to get better. You have to put in the hours to improve your skill in that thing, whether that's playing piano, whatever, right? Playing a sport, whatever it is, flying airplanes. You have to learn that new skill. But then once you get to a certain level of experience, you gain confidence in your skill. And in a broad stroke of irony, this is where you are actually the most dangerous. So especially in the flying world, and you can see by this graph here, which is a sort of a distributed graph of aircraft accidents by flight hours. And what you see is, right around the 700 to kind of 1,000 hour flying mark, which is pretty experienced. But what we see is a spike in aircraft accidents. And that seems sort of counterintuitive because you would expect aircraft accidents to happen in the newbie realm, right? This sort of 0 hour to 100 hour realm. And that's actually not the case. It really ramps up in that semi-mid experience, early mid experience level. And the reason for that is because at this point in your career, you've gained experience and you are confident in your skill, but you're slightly overconfident in your skill. And so your skills and your confidence level don't actually match up. There's a mismatch between the two things of like, I have this much confidence, but really only this much skill. And you can see as the graph slopes down here that like as you get more and more hours, your skill level catches up to your confidence level and you can overcome a lot of the issues that you might face. However, of course, right, like if you do something long enough, especially dangerous stuff like flying, you're bound to run into an accident. The difference here is that at that 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 beyond mark is you have the skills, the actual skills, not just think that you have the skills, but you have the actual skills to overcome some of those really catastrophic failures. Whereas in that 700 to 1,000 range, you think you have the skills and you will push your boundaries, but you don't necessarily have the skills to overcome the catastrophic events that you might face. So what does this mean for me in my everyday life? Well, know that, when you're trying stuff new, that you're gonna get to this phase where you feel comfortable, and you'll start to branch out into more challenging things. And what you'll see is you're actually gonna start to fail again in these new things, because your skill level and what you're attempting hasn't quite caught up with each other. I'll use the example of learning to play music, right? If you learn to play the piano or the guitar, for example, right? Like at first, when you're first learning, you may try very simple songs with very simple chord progressions or whatever, and that might give you just like the basis for your learning. And then as you grow in your skill and confidence, you will choose more and more difficult songs to learn. And at some point you will choose a song that is kind of like out of your skill level, but you'll think, I can definitely do this, right? And so you'll dive right in to doing that thing. And what you'll find is like, oh man, there's like a whole other like level, second level, third level of skill that I need to learn, right? And that applies to a wide range of events, be that sporting events or whatever, right? So what does that mean? Like, what do I do about that, right? Well, the one thing is like in places where like life and limb are not on the line, right? And even in places where life and limb are on the line, sometimes in a controlled way, it's important to push those boundaries, right? That's how you develop second and third level, more advanced skills, right? In aviation, we do this in controlled environments through exercises and training, right? But still, you have to be wary of the risk and consequences that come along with these sort of catastrophic failures. In a lot of things in life, you don't necessarily face these catastrophic failures, but there are places where you could. Driving, right? Young teenage drivers, for example, face this similar thing where they spend their first year kind of learning, but then as they get to like 17 and 18, as we know, like men pay higher car insurance premiums until they're like 25 for this very reason, right? And then at this point, they kind of chill out. They learn they know what they don't know, right? And they learn their limits. But you have to kind of push the boundaries to learn your limits. So what do I do? Like if I'm doing stuff like learning music or whatever, maybe that pushing boundaries is good, but I have to recognize that, hey, there's going to be instances where I might fail, and I might fail catastrophically at learning these very difficult new pieces. In other parts of my life where things, or the risks are higher, mountain climbing, driving, riding motorcycle, whatever it is that you do, right? Recognize that once I get some experience level, that I'm actually entering a very dangerous phase of where my skills and my confidence don't necessarily match up. And so I can find ways to push my skills, like, for example, going out with more experienced riders or climbers or whatever, skiers, for example, right? And I can get them to help me, right? I can get instruction or further instruction, more advanced instruction to learn more advanced skills, and then I can feel a little more comfortable. But in all cases, right, I need to do that in a controlled way and recognize that I'm actually entering a very dangerous, part of the world. Obviously, the consequences are not in all cases as dire as they might be in aviation, but nevertheless, they do exist. So, keep pushing those boundaries, do so safely if you're doing things that might risk life and limb, but know that, hey, I'm going to find that learning curve again once I've kind of mastered the basic skills. Glad you're tuning in. Follow me on YouTube, on Instagram, Fighter Pilot Professor, and shoot me your questions when you get a chance. Have a good one.